In the fall of 1993, the Walker family was living in Columbus, Ohio, in a modest neighborhood where people measured life by work schedules, school calendars, grocery prices, and the hope that one good weekend could make up for several hard months. Thomas Walker worked as an auto mechanic at a small garage on the east side of the city. Rebecca Walker took part-time shifts at a neighborhood laundromat and managed the home with the careful patience of someone who knew exactly how far a paycheck could stretch before it broke. They had 3 children. Noah was 12, old enough to understand money was not something his parents spent lightly. Madison was 8, bright, trusting, and full of the kind of excitement that could make an ordinary family outing feel like the most important event of the year. Grace was 6, still young enough to believe that wherever her family went, nothing truly bad could happen as long as everyone stayed together. For weeks, the autumn fair had been the one promise inside the Walker home. It was not a luxury trip, not a vacation, not anything large enough to appear important to outsiders. But to the Walkers, it mattered. It meant Thomas had taken extra hours. It meant Rebecca had saved small amounts from grocery money. It meant the children had something to count down to, something bright in a year that had been mostly ordinary and tiring. The fair was the kind of local American event families trusted without thinking too much. It had school groups, church volunteers, food stands, small rides, carnival games, and parents who believed that a crowded public place could still be safe if everyone paid attention. For Thomas and Rebecca, it was meant to be one evening where bills, repairs, and long shifts did not follow them. For the children, it was simply the night they had been waiting for. Madison wore her favorite light blue dress, the one Rebecca had kept clean especially for that evening. It was simple, not expensive, but Madison loved it because it made the fair feel like an occasion. Noah had promised he would win something for her if they had enough tickets left, and by the middle of the evening, he had done exactly that. The prize was a small stuffed bear from one of the game booths, the kind with uneven stitching and cheap fabric. But to Madison it became immediately precious. That small bear would later become one of the details Rebecca remembered most painfully, because it proved how normal the evening had been before everything changed. The Walkers moved through the fair with the careful rhythm of a family that had to make choices. Not every ride was possible. Not every snack could be bought. Thomas kept track of tickets. Rebecca kept track of time. Noah tried to seem older than he was, though he still cared about the games. Grace was quiet in the noise, staying close to the safety of the family group. Madison was the one who gave the night its energy. She treated every booth, every prize, every ride ticket as if it had been placed there just for her. Nothing about that evening suggested danger. There was no warning strong enough to remain in memory before the loss. No single face stood out. No one in the family noticed a pattern. No moment announced itself as the last safe minute. That was what would torment Rebecca for years. The fact that disaster arrived inside something ordinary, inside a place filled with other parents, other children, other families doing the same thing. As the evening moved toward its busiest hour, the Walkers reached the food and candy area near one of the main walkways. Thomas was thinking about what they could still afford before leaving. Rebecca was trying to balance the children's requests without disappointing anyone. Noah had already used part of his remaining tickets. Grace wanted something sweet but could not decide what. Madison still had the little stuffed bear and a balloon from earlier in the night. The crowd thickened around the food stands. People were waiting in lines, moving between booths, calling out orders, searching for their own families. For a few seconds, the Walker family became part of that moving crowd instead of a single clear group. Rebecca's attention shifted toward the candy stand, the prices, the choices, and the small decision of whether there was enough money left for one more treat. That was all the time it took. Madison had been there, close enough to be included in the family's ordinary awareness, close enough that no one had reason to panic. Then she was not there. The space where she should have been became empty in a way that did not make sense at first. Her balloon remained near the candy stand. The small stuffed bear was no longer with the family. The light blue dress Rebecca had kept clean for the fair was no longer visible among the moving colors of the crowd. At first, the absence seemed impossible. Children drifted a few steps away at fairs. Families lost sight of one another for moments. A child could be behind a parent, beside a booth, blocked by someone taller, distracted by a display. The mind resisted the first terrible conclusion because accepting it too quickly would mean the world had changed in seconds. But the seconds did not return Madison. Thomas and Rebecca's evening split apart at that exact point. Everything before it belonged to one life, the life of a working family at a fall fair in Columbus, trying to give their children one good memory. Everything after it belonged to another life entirely. A life defined by a missing child, by questions with no immediate answers, by the unbearable knowledge that love and attention had not been enough to stop one small girl from vanishing in a public place. Within minutes, the fair no longer felt like a celebration to the Walker family. The same booths, the same lights, the same music, and the same crowd became part of a terrifying confusion. Madison's name became the only thing that mattered. The ordinary sounds of the fair continued around them, but for Thomas, Rebecca, Noah, and Grace, the night had narrowed to one fact that could not be undone. Madison Walker, 8 years old, had disappeared at the Columbus Fall Fair in 1993. She had not wandered home. She had not returned to the ride area. She had not found another family member. She had vanished during a moment so brief and so ordinary that no one would ever be able to explain how it had opened wide enough to take her away. For the Walker family, that was where the story truly began. Not with answers, not with evidence, not with a clear suspect, but with a light blue dress missing from a crowded fair and a family forced into a nightmare before they even understood what had happened. The first minutes after Madison Walker disappeared were filled with the kind of confusion that later became impossible for the family to describe without feeling that time itself had betrayed them. At the Columbus Fall Fair in 1993, a missing child did not immediately turn a public event into a locked-down crime scene. There were no smartphones, no instant social media alerts, no crowd-wide text messages, no quick sharing of a photo to thousands of people within seconds. There was only panic spreading through ordinary people, fair workers trying to understand what had happened, and a family realizing that every minute mattered. Thomas and Rebecca first believed Madison had been swallowed by the crowd in the simplest, least terrifying sense. A child could step toward another booth. A child could follow the smell of popcorn or cotton candy. A child could become confused and wait near a ride, thinking her family would find her. That first explanation was the one their minds needed, because anything darker was too large to accept. Noah and Grace were kept close while Madison's name began moving from one person to another, from family members to nearby parents, from booth workers to the small fair office where lost children were usually brought. But Madison was not at the lost child station. No worker had taken her there. No parent had found her crying near the food booths. No volunteer remembered seeing an 8-year-old girl in a light blue dress asking for help. The small, ordinary systems that were supposed to solve small, ordinary problems produced nothing. The fair organizers reacted with concern at first, then with urgency. A description was written down. Madison Walker, 8 years old, light blue dress, brown hair, last seen near the candy and food area, possibly carrying a small stuffed bear. The announcement went out over the fair's public address system. It sounded official, but to the Walkers it did not sound strong enough. It sounded like something used for misplaced wallets or children who had wandered toward the bathrooms. Madison had been gone too long for that. Within a short time, fair security began checking the exits, the ride lines, the restrooms, the employee areas, the parking lots, and the spaces where vendors stored extra supplies. Volunteers joined because many of them were parents themselves. Some were strangers who had brought their own children to the fair and suddenly understood that the Walker family's fear could have belonged to anyone. The search widened quickly, but not cleanly. Too many people were moving, too many cars were leaving, too many details were uncertain. The Columbus police were called, and the first responding officers treated the situation as urgent but still open-ended. At that point, there was no proof of abduction, only a missing girl in a crowded public place. That distinction mattered to the adults handling the scene, but it did not matter to Rebecca. To her, Madison's absence was already evidence of something terribly wrong. A responsible child did not disappear without calling for her family. Madison did not know the fairgrounds well enough to leave on her own. She did not have money, she did not have a plan, and she had no reason to walk away. Detective Harold Bennett arrived later that night and took over the early investigation. He was experienced enough to understand that the first hours of a missing child case could decide everything. He gathered the basic facts quickly. The exact location where Madison was last seen, the time frame, the clothing, the family members present, the item she had been carrying, and whether anyone had noticed an adult paying unusual attention to her. Every answer seemed necessary, and every answer seemed painfully incomplete. The first witness statements were collected near the food stands. Several people remembered a girl who might have been Madison. But the fair had many children, many dresses, many rushed impressions. A mother from a nearby suburb thought she had seen a girl in blue near a lemonade booth, but she was not certain of the time. A teenage ride worker remembered a young girl asking about tickets earlier in the evening, but could not say whether it was Madison. A vendor believed he had seen a child holding a stuffed animal near the walkway that led toward the restrooms, but his memory changed when he was asked for details. Then came the statement that altered the entire direction of the night. An older woman who had attended the fair with her grandchildren told Detective Bennett that she had noticed a child matching Madison's description near one of the side exits. The girl had not seemed fully alone. The woman remembered a tall man near her, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. At first, the woman assumed he was a father, uncle, or family friend. The fair was full of children moving with adults, and no one wanted to imagine danger in every passing pair. But after hearing Madison's description over the loudspeaker, the memory returned with a sharp and troubling force. The timing was close enough to matter. It was after Madison had vanished from the candy area, but not so late that the trail was useless. The side exit led toward a parking area and a stretch of road where cars could leave without passing the main entrance. If the witness was right, Madison had not simply wandered deeper into the fair. She may have been taken toward the edge of it. Detective Bennett did not treat the statement as proof, but he treated it as a serious lead. Officers began asking about a tall man in a dark jacket and baseball cap. Fair workers were questioned about employees, vendors, maintenance crews, delivery drivers, and anyone who had access to areas not open to the public. The parking area became a priority. Drivers who had remained nearby were asked whether they had seen a man with a girl in a light blue dress. Some said no. Some were unsure. Some remembered too much only after hearing other people talk. The problem grew worse with every passing minute. A fair in 1993 left fewer traces than investigators needed. There were no useful digital records of who had entered and left. Security cameras were limited and not positioned to capture every walkway. Tickets had been paid in cash. Vendors came from different towns. Temporary workers used paper forms, sometimes with incomplete information. By the time police understood that Madison may have crossed the boundary between lost child and abducted child, countless people had already left the grounds. Thomas and Rebecca were asked to repeat Madison's description again and again. The light blue dress, the age, the stuffed bear, the balloon, the last place she was seen, the few seconds that had opened like a trap. Each repetition made the facts feel both sharper and more impossible. Noah listened to adults discuss timelines and exits with a seriousness no child should have had to understand. Grace remained inside a night that no one could explain to her in a way that made sense. By midnight, the fair had become an active search area. By the early morning hours, the nearby roads, gas stations, bus stops, and surrounding neighborhoods had been checked in fragments, never with the certainty anyone wanted. Madison's name had moved beyond the fairgrounds and into police radios, local calls, and the first steps of a case that was already growing too large for one family to hold. When daylight came, there was still no Madison. There was only a description, a missing child report, a frightened family, and the memory of a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap leading a little girl toward a side exit. That memory did not solve anything. It only changed the fear into something more specific. Madison Walker was no longer simply lost at the Columbus Fall Fair. She was now at the center of a suspected abduction, and the first night had ended without bringing her home. By the second day, Madison Walker's disappearance had changed from a local emergency into a case that carried the weight of every parent's worst fear. The Columbus police no longer treated the fairgrounds as the center of the story. The investigation had moved outward into employee records, vendor lists, vehicle descriptions, temporary work forms, and every name connected to the autumn fair on the night Madison vanished. Detective Harold Bennett understood that the witness statement about the tall man in the dark jacket and baseball cap could not stand alone. It was too incomplete, too dependent on memory, and too vulnerable to the confusion of a crowded family event. But it gave investigators something they had not had before: a possible adult, a possible direction, and a possible reason Madison had not been found anywhere near the fair after the first night. The first group of people investigated were the fair employees. Most were easy to identify. Some were local workers hired every year. Some were parents earning extra cash for the season. Some were college students taking temporary jobs before the weather turned cold. Others were part of traveling crews that moved from county to county, setting up rides, game booths, food stands, and small attractions. That last group created the greatest problem for police. In 1993, background checks for temporary fair workers were not as fast, complete, or connected as they would become decades later. Paper forms could be incomplete. Phone numbers could be outdated. Addresses could belong to motels, relatives, or places where the worker had not lived for months. Among the names on the employee list, one stood out quickly: Raymond Cole. Raymond Cole had been assigned to one of the children's rides Madison had visited earlier that evening. Several people remembered him because he had worked close to families for hours. He was 36 years old, tall, and usually wore a baseball cap while working. That alone did not make him guilty. Many workers fit general descriptions. But within 2 days of Madison's disappearance, Raymond Cole was gone. His supervisor told police that Cole had not returned for his next shift. He had not collected the remaining pay owed to him. He had not called to explain his absence. The address listed on his employment form led nowhere useful. The phone number did not belong to him. The references attached to his application could not be confirmed. For Detective Bennett, that combination changed Cole from a loose possibility into a serious person of interest. The detail that disturbed the Walker family most was that Madison had likely interacted with him before she disappeared. Children at fairs remembered ride operators in simple ways. They remembered who smiled, who spoke kindly, who gave extra time, who made a ride feel less frightening. Investigators learned from several families that Madison had been near Cole's ride more than once that evening. A few witnesses believed she had seemed comfortable around him, but no one could say whether that comfort came from a harmless fair interaction or from something more calculated. Thomas and Rebecca were forced to confront a new and unbearable possibility. Madison may not have been taken by a complete stranger she had never seen before. She may have been approached by someone who had already become familiar to her during the evening. That possibility made the case more frightening, because it explained how an 8-year-old could be drawn away from her family without causing an immediate disturbance. The search for Raymond Cole began with the information available on paper, and almost all of it failed. Police checked the address he had given and found no sign that he lived there. They contacted prior employers listed on the form and learned that some records were false or too vague to verify. A social security number associated with his paperwork raised more questions than answers. It may have been copied incorrectly, borrowed, or deliberately falsified. Every uncertainty made him seem more suspicious, but suspicion did not equal proof. The FBI was asked to assist as the case expanded. Madison's photograph appeared in local newspapers, on evening news broadcasts, and on flyers distributed across Columbus and nearby counties. Her description was sent to police departments in surrounding areas. Bus stations, truck stops, hospitals, diners, shelters, and motels were contacted. The Walker family's phone became a place where hope and fear arrived together. The calls came quickly. A woman in Dayton believed she had seen a girl matching Madison's description near a gas station. A man near Cincinnati reported a child in a blue dress with an older male in a parking lot. Someone in Indiana thought Madison had been seen inside a roadside diner. A store clerk in Kentucky claimed a frightened girl had come through with a traveling worker. Each report had to be checked. Each report carried the possibility of being the one that mattered. Each report consumed time, energy, and emotional strength. Most led nowhere. Some were honest mistakes. A child with the same hair color. A dress that sounded similar. A family passing through town with a daughter who resembled Madison from a distance. Some calls came from people who wanted to help, but had absorbed details from television and reshaped uncertain memories around them. A few were cruel, the kind of calls that appear in public tragedies and deepen the wound without offering anything real. Detective Bennett warned the family that high-profile missing child cases often produced a flood of false leads. He knew the warning was necessary, but it did not make the process easier for Thomas or Rebecca. The more Madison's image spread, the larger the investigation became, and the less clear it felt. The case generated attention, but attention created noise. Police had to separate real information from fear, rumor, guilt, and imagination. Every hour spent checking a false sighting was an hour lost from another possible lead. Yet no lead could be ignored because Madison was 8 years old, and the cost of dismissing the right call was unthinkable. Raymond Cole remained the strongest name in the file, but he remained out of reach. His disappearance after the fair looked damning, but investigators had no witness who could place Madison in his vehicle. No one had seen him force her away. No physical evidence connected him to the balloon, the candy stand, or the side exit. The witness who remembered the tall man with the baseball cap could not identify Cole with certainty. Other witnesses gave details that contradicted one another. Some thought the man's jacket was black. Others thought it was navy. One person remembered a cap with a logo. Another did not remember a logo at all. In a courtroom, those differences would matter. In a family's heart, they did not. For the Walkers, Raymond Cole became the shape of their unanswered questions. Thomas wanted him found because a missing suspect felt like a door that had to be opened. Rebecca wanted him found because the idea of not knowing who had been near Madison in those final moments became impossible to live with. Noah heard the adults repeat Cole's name often enough that it became fixed in his memory. Grace was too young to understand the investigation, but even she understood that the family had begun to fear one name more than others. Days turned into weeks, and the case entered a more exhausting stage. The urgency remained, but the first wave of immediate search activity began to thin. The fair had moved on. Vendors returned to other towns. Families who had attended that night went back to their lives. Police continued working, but the physical moment of Madison's disappearance had passed into memory, and memory was proving unstable. Detective Bennett kept Raymond Cole at the center of the active investigation, but the case did not break open. FBI assistance brought resources and broader coordination, yet even federal involvement could not create evidence that had not been preserved in those first hours. There were no useful camera recordings from the critical exit, no reliable license plate, no confirmed route, no recovered stuffed bear, no verified sighting after the side exit. The Walker family learned that a case could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Madison's face could be on television. Her name could be in newspapers. Her flyer could be taped to store windows, and still no one could tell them where she was. The country could be asked to look for her, and still she could remain beyond reach. By the end of the first major wave of investigation, Raymond Cole was wanted for questioning, Madison was still missing, and the Walkers were trapped between two kinds of pain. One came from not knowing. The other came from knowing just enough to imagine the worst. The case had gained a suspect, a theory, and national attention, but it had not gained Madison. And for Thomas, Rebecca, Noah, and Grace, nothing else could be called progress. The months after Madison Walker disappeared did not move like normal time for the Walker family. They did not become a sequence of days, weeks, and holidays. They became a single long emergency stretched across the calendar, with no clear ending and no moment when anyone in the house could honestly say life had continued. Every ordinary task carried the weight of Madison's absence. Every phone call had the power to break them open again. Every unanswered lead made the house feel smaller, colder, and harder to survive. Thomas could not return to the garage in the same way he had before. Work had once been the center of his responsibility as a father. He had repaired engines, taken extra jobs, accepted long hours, and measured his worth by whether the lights stayed on and the children had what they needed. After Madison vanished, the idea of spending hours under the hood of someone else's car while his daughter was missing felt impossible. He took time away from the garage at first, then more time, then enough time that money became another pressure inside a family already breaking under grief. His search became daily, repetitive, and relentless. He followed every call, every rumor, every reported sighting that sounded even slightly possible. He drove to towns outside Columbus, checked bus stations, contacted shelters, visited diners, and asked questions that almost never produced answers. Some people were kind. Some were uncomfortable. Some had already seen Madison's face on television and wanted desperately to help. But kindness did not bring her home, and sympathy did not become evidence. Rebecca lived inside a different kind of punishment. The moment at the candy stand replayed in her mind with cruel precision. A few seconds of divided attention became the center of her guilt. She knew other people told her she was not to blame. She knew parents could not hold every child's hand every second of every public outing. She knew the fair had been full of families who made the same small choices she had made. None of that changed the fact that Madison had been beside her, and then Madison was gone. The Walker home became a place organized around waiting. Madison's room remained untouched in the ways that mattered. Her school things stayed where they had been. Her belongings were not packed away. Her absence was not treated as permanent because to do that would have felt like betrayal. Rebecca kept routines that no longer had practical meaning, holding on to the idea that a child who came home would need evidence that she had never been replaced, erased, or given up on. Noah changed quickly during those months. At 12, he was old enough to understand that adults could fail, police could run out of leads, and television attention could fade. He was also young enough to believe he should have done something more. He remembered winning the stuffed bear for Madison. He remembered the fair as the last place where he had still been only an older brother, not a witness to a family tragedy. Afterward, he carried a quiet burden that no one knew how to remove. His grades slipped. His patience disappeared. School became a place where other children's normal problems seemed almost insulting. Teachers tried to help, but their concern often made him feel more separate from everyone else. Grace was 6, and her understanding came through fragments. She knew Madison was missing. She knew her parents were no longer the same. She knew Noah had become quieter and angrier. She knew adults lowered their voices when her sister's name came up, as if the name itself could break something. She asked questions that no one could answer simply enough for a child. Those questions became some of the hardest moments for Rebecca, because they required hope and honesty at the same time, and the family had almost none of either. The first Christmas without Madison arrived like a second disaster. American homes around them moved into the familiar rhythm of school programs, church events, neighborhood decorations, holiday sales, and family gatherings. For the Walkers, every tradition became a reminder of the missing child at the center of the family. Madison's gift had already been purchased before the holiday. It remained unopened. No one knew whether leaving it wrapped was hopeful or unbearable, but unwrapping it was impossible. Thomas tried to preserve something for Noah and Grace, because 2 children were still in the house and still needed parents. That effort made the holiday even more painful. Any attempt at normalcy felt forced. Any moment of quiet felt like surrender. Rebecca could not separate celebration from guilt. To laugh felt wrong. To cook Madison's favorite foods felt devastating. To avoid them felt worse. The holiday passed without giving anyone comfort, and afterward the family understood that time would continue placing dates in front of them whether they were ready or not. As winter turned into the next year, the investigation lost some of its early force. Detective Harold Bennett remained committed, but the number of active leads declined. The first wave of calls had been checked. Raymond Cole had not been located. Reported sightings had collapsed into mistakes, uncertainty, or deliberate cruelty. The FBI's support continued in limited ways, but without fresh evidence, the case began to move toward a colder category, the one families feared because it sounded like being left behind. To the police, a cold case did not mean the file was closed. It meant the investigation had no current leads strong enough to justify the same level of manpower. To Thomas, that distinction meant almost nothing. His daughter was still 8 years old in every photograph they released. She was still missing. He could not understand how a system could reduce urgency while the central fact remained unchanged. Madison had not been found. Therefore, the emergency was not over. That belief pushed him further into his own search. When official attention slowed, Thomas tried to replace it with personal effort. He copied flyers, made calls, contacted local television stations, reached out to parents in other missing child cases, and traveled whenever a possible sighting seemed worth pursuing. Money disappeared into gas, long-distance calls, printing costs, and small trips that ended in silence. The family's finances grew fragile, but Thomas could not place a budget around the search for his daughter. Rebecca found a different path through the same grief. She began attending meetings for families of missing children and victims of violent crime. At first, the meetings hurt more than they helped. Other people's stories showed her how long grief could last, how many families lived for years without answers, how many parents learned to function while still waiting. But over time, those rooms gave her something the outside world could not. People who did not expect her to be better, did not tell her to move on, and did not mistake survival for healing. Through those groups, Rebecca learned the language of advocacy. She learned how to keep a case visible after the first wave of media attention faded. She learned how to speak to reporters without letting them turn Madison into a headline only. She learned how to support another mother during the first days of a disappearance, even while her own daughter remained missing. Her grief did not shrink, but it began to find a direction. The Walker family was not healed. They were not stronger in the simple way people sometimes claimed after tragedy. They were damaged, exhausted, and changed. Thomas became consumed by the search. Rebecca became anchored to the cause of missing children. Noah and Grace grew up around an absence that shaped their childhood more than any normal family memory could. By the time Madison's case was treated as cold, the Walkers had already entered a new life, one they had never chosen. The first stage of panic had passed, but no peace had replaced it. The fair was gone from the headlines. The public had begun to move on. But inside the Walker home, Madison was still missing every morning, every night, every holiday, and every time the phone rang. 10 years after Madison Walker disappeared, the Walker family had learned how to live in a way that looked almost normal from the outside. Bills were paid. Work schedules were kept. Birthdays came and went. School years ended and began. Neighbors saw Thomas's truck leave early and return late. People saw Rebecca at community meetings, church events, and missing child awareness programs. Noah and Grace grew taller, older, and quieter in the ways children do when childhood has been interrupted by something no one can repair. But inside the family, Madison was not past tense. She remained 8 years old in the photograph most often used on flyers. She remained the daughter who should have grown into middle school, then high school. She remained the sister whose absence had shaped every choice Noah and Grace made without them fully understanding it at first. The Walker family did not speak of moving on, because moving on sounded like leaving Madison behind. Instead, they learned to move forward while carrying her with them. By the early 2000s, Thomas had returned more fully to his work as an auto mechanic. But the man who came back to the garage was not the same father who had taken his children to the fair in 1993. He still fixed cars, still dealt with customers, still worked long hours when money required it. Yet much of his life outside work remained tied to Madison's case. He kept copies of old flyers in his truck. He kept a list of contacts in other counties and states. He stayed in touch with parents who knew the same kind of waiting. He called police departments when a possible unidentified child or young woman appeared in the news. He followed leads less recklessly than he had in the first years, but he never stopped following them. The search had changed form. It was no longer the desperate, daily chase that had nearly destroyed him in the first months. It had become a discipline, a grim routine, a promise repeated through action rather than words. Thomas understood by then that one man could not outwork every failure in the system. But he also believed a father had no right to become passive while his child remained missing. Rebecca's grief had also changed, though it had not softened. In the first years, her guilt had been centered on the few seconds near the candy stand. By the 10th year, that guilt had become something broader and more complicated. She still carried the pain of that night, but she had begun using it to sit beside other mothers in the earliest hours of their own disasters. Through missing child support groups and victim advocacy networks, Rebecca became known as someone who could speak without offering false comfort. She did not tell families that everything would be fine. She told them which calls to make, which forms to keep, which names to write down, which details mattered, and why they should never allow a case to vanish quietly after the cameras disappeared. That work gave her a purpose she had never asked for. It did not replace Madison. It did not heal the loss. But it made the loss useful in a world where useless suffering felt unbearable. Rebecca became part of local awareness campaigns in Columbus, helping organize events for missing children and supporting efforts to improve communication between law enforcement, schools, shelters, hospitals, and families. She learned how easily cases could fall through gaps when agencies failed to share information. She learned how families with fewer resources were often pushed aside faster. And every lesson she learned carried Madison's name inside it. Noah's path was shaped by the case in a sharper way. At 12, he had been Madison's older brother. By young adulthood, he had become someone who saw the law not as an abstract system, but as something that either protected families or failed them. He had grown up watching detectives struggle with weak evidence, watching his parents battle bureaucracy, watching a missing child become a file that could cool with time. That knowledge pushed him toward criminal justice, then victim advocacy, then law. He did not choose that path because it was easy or because it allowed him to escape grief. He chose it because the grief had already chosen him. Noah wanted to understand warrants, records, jurisdiction, evidence, and the rights of families left waiting for answers. He wanted to know why a man like Raymond Cole could disappear behind false paperwork. He wanted to know why temporary workers at public events had not been screened better. He wanted to know what could be changed so that other families did not spend years hearing that there was nothing more to do. Grace's connection to Madison was different. She had been 6 when her sister disappeared, young enough that memory and family stories became tangled over time. She remembered Madison in fragments, but she grew up with Madison everywhere. In photographs, in yearly vigils, in the careful silence that arrived at holidays, in Rebecca's advocacy work, in Thomas's records, in Noah's anger at systems that failed too easily. Grace became observant because her home taught her that important details could be missed. She became drawn to writing because words seemed to be the one way to hold what time tried to blur. By college age, Grace turned toward journalism. Not celebrity reporting, not entertainment, not the easy rhythm of stories that vanished after a day. She wanted the kind of reporting that followed old cases, challenged official timelines, and kept forgotten names alive. Madison's disappearance became the private center of her public ambition. Grace knew how a child's face could fade from the news while the family continued living inside the emergency. She wanted to write in a way that made people look again. Each year, the Walkers held a small remembrance near the date Madison disappeared. It was never just a memorial, because no one in the family accepted that Madison's story had ended. It was not quite a celebration either, because celebration required a kind of certainty they did not have. It became something in between. A public act of memory, a refusal to let the case disappear, a gathering for families who understood that waiting could last longer than anyone imagined. At these events, Madison's photograph was displayed beside newer age progressed images created with help from national missing child organizations. The image of the 8-year-old in the light blue dress remained the one people recognized, but the family forced themselves to imagine her older. 13, 16, teen. Each new image hurt because it admitted time had passed without her. Each new image mattered because it reminded the public that Madison, if alive, would not still look like the little girl on the original flyer. The old fair location also became part of local memory. For many people in Columbus, it was simply the place where a terrible thing had happened long ago. For the Walkers, it was the dividing line of their lives. Before the fair, they had been an ordinary family with ordinary worries. After the fair, every member of the family had been reshaped by absence. The 10th year did not bring answers. It did not bring Raymond Cole. It did not bring a confirmed sighting. It did not bring Madison home. But it revealed what the Walkers had become in the space left by her disappearance. Thomas had become a father who searched with discipline instead of panic. Rebecca had become an advocate for families at the beginning of the same nightmare. Noah had turned toward the law because he had seen how much damage unanswered questions could do. Grace had turned toward journalism because silence felt like another way of losing someone. Madison's disappearance had broken the Walker family, but it had not emptied them. Their pain had become work. Their waiting had become a public promise. Their love had become larger than the home where it began. And even after 10 years, the family still believed one thing with a stubbornness that no cold case label could erase. Madison Walker deserved to be found, and until she was, none of them would allow the world to forget her. In 2018, 25 years after Madison Walker disappeared from the Columbus Fall Fair, the case returned to the center of the family's life with a force none of them had expected. By then, Madison's name had survived in public memory mostly because the Walkers had refused to let it fade. Thomas still kept records. Rebecca still supported families in crisis. Noah had built his legal work around victims' rights. Grace had become a journalist with a reputation for returning to stories other people considered too old to matter. For Grace, Madison's disappearance was never simply a family tragedy. It was the reason she believed journalism had a duty beyond publishing what was new. Some stories were not old because they were finished. Some were old because the right question had not been asked at the right time. That belief had guided her reporting through articles on missing children, weak interagency communication, and the quiet ways vulnerable people disappeared from official attention. The new lead came because of one of those articles. Grace had written about how missing child investigations from the 1980s and 1990s were often weakened by poor record sharing between police departments, hospitals, schools, and child welfare offices. The article mentioned Madison only briefly, not as the focus, but as one example of a case where early hours had never been fully reconstructed. It asked whether a child could have passed through a medical system, a shelter, or an emergency service without being properly connected to a missing person report. A few days after publication, Grace received a message from a retired nurse named Patricia Mills. Patricia had worked in a small private hospital outside Columbus in the early 1990s. The hospital had changed ownership more than once, and its old name was mostly forgotten outside medical records and former staff. Patricia said she had carried a memory for decades, one she had never been able to fully explain and had never been brave enough to bring forward. Grace had received many messages over the years from people who thought they knew something about Madison. Most led nowhere. But Patricia's message was different because it did not begin with certainty. It began with hesitation, guilt, and specific dates. Patricia said that in the early morning after the fair, a young girl had been brought into the hospital without identification. The child was believed to be around 8 years old. She was listed in hospital paperwork as Jane Doe because no clear name had been recorded. She did not provide family information. She did not answer questions in a way that helped staff identify her. There were no obvious injuries severe enough to explain everything, but the child was described in notes as frightened, withdrawn, and possibly in shock. Grace read Patricia's words several times before she allowed herself to connect them to Madison. The timing was unbearable. The morning after the fair, a girl around 8, no identification, no name, a small private hospital outside Columbus. If Patricia was remembering correctly, Madison might not have been taken far away immediately. She might have been within reach of the city, inside a building where a phone call to the right police department could have changed everything. Grace did not tell her parents at first. She contacted Noah. By 2018, Noah understood both the power and danger of a late lead. Families of missing children could be destroyed all over again by information that sounded true but collapsed under examination. He approached Patricia's account with caution, not because he wanted to doubt it, but because he knew what false hope had already done to Thomas and Rebecca. He asked Grace to preserve every message, document every detail, and avoid promising anything until they could verify the hospital records. The first obstacle was the hospital itself. The original facility no longer operated under the same ownership. Older paper records had been moved, scanned, misplaced, or destroyed according to retention rules that were often difficult to track after decades. Administrators were reluctant to discuss a possible minor patient from 1993, especially one connected to a missing child case. They cited privacy rules, incomplete archives, and the difficulty of confirming any account from that long ago. Noah pushed through the hesitation using his legal knowledge and professional contacts. Grace's reporting increased pressure without turning the lead into a public spectacle too early. Patricia agreed to provide a written statement. She gave the approximate date, the former unit where she had worked, the name of a doctor associated with the case, and the detail that had haunted her most. The child had been discharged after 3 days to people described in the paperwork only as relatives. There was no clear documentation proving who those people were. That missing detail became the center of everything. When limited hospital records were finally located, they confirmed the core of Patricia's story. A female child, estimated at 8 years old, had been admitted in the early morning hours after Madison vanished. She had been registered as Jane Doe. The notes referred to acute emotional distress and an inability or refusal to provide identifying information. The records did not show a proper law enforcement notification attached to the file. They did not show coordination with a missing child report. They did not show that anyone compared the child with the alert already circulating in Columbus. Most disturbing of all, the discharge record listed release to family care, but the names were incomplete. The identification field was either blank or missing, and the authorization signature could not be verified. The doctor who had overseen the case was dead. Some former hospital employees had no memory of the girl. Others remembered irregular practices from that period but could not connect them directly to Madison. The hospital had been small, privately run, and overwhelmed at times by staffing shortages. Its record-keeping had depended heavily on paper forms, internal judgment, and the assumption that adults claiming a child had the right to take that child. In 1993, before modern electronic sharing and faster missing child data systems became more common, a failure in one place could become invisible everywhere else. For the Walker family, the discovery was almost too painful to absorb. Madison had not simply vanished into empty space. There was now a possibility that she had passed through an institution that should have protected her. She may have been alive in Columbus after the fair. She may have been close enough that Thomas was searching within the same city while his daughter's name was sitting under Jane Doe in a hospital file. Rebecca's years of guilt over a few seconds at the candy stand were suddenly joined by a different kind of anger. The possibility that adults, systems, and procedures had failed Madison after the abduction had already occurred. Thomas received the news as both a wound and a spark. For 25 years, the family had lived with fragments. The side exit, the man in the baseball cap, Raymond Cole's disappearance, false sightings, unanswered calls. Now, for the first time in decades, there was a documented point in time after the fair where a child matching Madison's age had been recorded by an institution. It was not proof that the child was Madison, but it was too close to ignore. Rebecca understood the meaning from another angle. Through years of helping other families, she had warned parents that the first 72 hours could define a case. Now those same hours had returned to accuse everyone who had missed the connection. If the hospital had reported the Jane Doe child properly, if police had been notified clearly, if the records had been checked against Madison's missing child alert, the Walker family might have had a chance before the trail disappeared. Grace knew the story had to be handled carefully. She did not want Madison reduced to a shocking headline. She wanted the truth documented in a way that forced action. Noah began preparing legal requests and contacting investigators who still had access to Madison's cold case file. Detective Harold Bennett had long since retired, but the case still existed. It had a number, a history, boxes of records, and now a reason to be opened again. The retired nurse's memory did not bring Madison home. It did not identify who had taken the Jane Doe child from the hospital. It did not prove what happened next, but it changed the entire shape of the case. For 25 years, the Walkers had believed the trail ended at the fair. In 2018, they learned it may have continued into a hospital, onto a paper form, through a discharge process that should never have been so vague, and out through the hands of adults no one had properly identified. That discovery did not answer the question of where Madison was. It made the question larger, darker, and more urgent than it had been in years. The discovery of the hospital record did not end Madison Walker's case. It reopened it in a way that made the past feel active again, as if 25 years had not buried the truth but only hidden it beneath weak paperwork, vanished witnesses, and decisions no one had been forced to answer for. After 2018, the Walker family no longer had only memories, rumors, and the name Raymond Cole. They had a documented failure point. A child recorded as Jane Doe had entered a private hospital outside Columbus shortly after Madison vanished, and that child had been released to unidentified adults 3 days later. That single fact changed everything. Noah pushed for the case to be treated not only as a missing child investigation, but as a possible trafficking case with institutional negligence. His legal work had already placed him in contact with victim rights attorneys, retired federal investigators, and nonprofit groups that studied old patterns in child exploitation cases. Grace used her position as a journalist carefully, publishing only what could be responsibly supported while continuing to ask questions that had gone unasked for too long. Thomas and Rebecca, now older and more careful with hope, allowed themselves to believe that Madison's story had not ended at the fair, but had moved through a system that failed to recognize her. The renewed investigation brought federal attention back into the case. Investigators began comparing Madison's disappearance with other unsolved cases from the 1990s involving children who vanished from fairs, church carnivals, shopping centers, youth events, and temporary public gatherings across several states. At first, the connections seemed thin. A missing girl in Ohio, a missing boy in Indiana, another girl taken near a county fair in Pennsylvania, a child reported missing after a community festival in Kentucky. Each case had its own local history, its own devastated family, its own set of abandoned leads. But when investigators looked beyond the surface, patterns emerged. Several of the cases involved temporary workers using incomplete identities. Several had early reports of unidentified children appearing in hospitals, clinics, shelters, or short-term care facilities without proper cross-checking. Some involved adults claiming to be relatives without documentation that would meet later standards. The failures were not identical, but they were similar enough to suggest that certain criminals had learned how to exploit gaps between local police departments, private medical facilities, child welfare systems, and interstate movement. Madison's case became one part of a larger map. Raymond Cole remained important, but he was no longer the only possible answer. His disappearance after the fair still mattered. His false employment information still mattered. Yet the hospital record suggested more than one man acting alone. It suggested coordination. It suggested that Madison may have been moved from the fair to the hospital, then from the hospital into a network that had handled other children in similar ways. For the Walker family, that possibility was both devastating and strangely clarifying. For years, they had feared that one unknown man had taken Madison and erased her completely. Now they faced something larger and colder. Madison may have been processed through a chain of adults, each person doing one part, each failure protecting the next person from being seen clearly. The breakthrough came gradually, not dramatically. Federal investigators, working with information from several reopened cases, identified an old trafficking network that had operated across parts of the Midwest and into the West Coast during the 1990s. Many of the central figures were dead, imprisoned for other crimes, or living under new names. Some had never been charged with trafficking because the earlier cases had been treated separately by local jurisdictions. Others had hidden behind legitimate work, transportation, temporary labor, private caregiving, small religious charities, and seasonal employment. One name surfaced through plea negotiations in an unrelated federal case: Victor Harlan. Harlan had once worked as a middleman, a person who did not always take children himself but helped move them, place them, or pass them along to others. By the time investigators questioned him about the older cases, he was no longer powerful. He had reasons to cooperate, reasons to minimize his own role, and reasons to tell just enough truth to help himself. Noah understood that immediately. A man like Victor Harlan was not a savior bringing answers. He was part of the machinery that had destroyed families, Still, his information could not be ignored. Harlan described a girl taken from a public fair in Ohio in the early 1990s. He did not remember every name or claimed he did not, but he remembered details that matched Madison's case too closely to dismiss. He referred to a child who had been frightened, quiet, around 8 years old, and briefly placed in a medical facility after becoming difficult to manage. He described how the adults involved preferred small hospitals and private clinics because records could be vague, staff could be pressured, and a child listed without a name could be removed before anyone connected the case to a missing child alert. He also described a transfer westward. According to Harlan, the girl from Ohio had not remained in the state. She had been moved through several hands, first within the region, then farther away. His account did not provide a clean final destination. It did not prove where Madison had lived, whether she had survived, or who had controlled her after the first stage. But it gave investigators a framework that fit the hospital record and explained why she had vanished so completely despite intense early searching. Thomas and Rebecca received the information with a grief that had aged but not weakened. There was relief in knowing that their instincts had not been wrong. Madison had not simply wandered away. She had not abandoned them. She had not disappeared because of a family failure. She had been taken into something organized enough to hide her. But that same knowledge carried its own cruelty. If Harlan's account was true, Madison had survived at least long enough to be moved across states, which meant she had endured a life her parents had never been able to protect her from. Grace continued writing, but now her work became more dangerous emotionally. Her articles connected Madison's case to systemic failures: temporary fair labor screening, poor medical reporting standards, lack of database coordination, and the way old cases had been treated as isolated tragedies when they may have been related. Her reporting reached readers far beyond Ohio, especially survivors groups and advocates in California, where some of the trafficking network's later operations were believed to have led. In 2023, 30 years after Madison disappeared, Grace received a letter at the office where she worked. The envelope had been mailed from California. There was no return address that could be traced to a person. The handwriting was careful, controlled, and unfamiliar. At first, Grace treated it like many other letters she had received over the years. Possible information, possible mistake, possible cruelty. But the first page changed everything. The writer identified herself as Madison Walker. The letter did not read like a confession designed for attention. It read like something written after years of silence had become heavier than fear. The writer said she was alive. She said she had known her real name for many years but had lived under protected identities. She said she had followed the Walker family from a distance, first through newspapers and later through online articles, missing child databases, interviews, and Grace's reporting. She said she had seen how Thomas and Rebecca never stopped searching, how Noah had turned the family's pain into legal work, and how Grace had kept Madison's name alive through journalism. The details inside the letter made it impossible for Grace to dismiss. The writer knew the nickname Thomas had used for Madison when she was little. She knew the song Rebecca often played while making breakfast before school. She knew about the stuffed bear Noah had won at the fair and the small flaw in its stitching. She knew about a childhood game Grace had loved before she was old enough to understand why everyone in the house had changed. These were not details from news reports. They belonged to the private life of the Walker family before the fair divided it. The letter also explained why Madison had not come forward sooner. The writer said she had spent years under different names after escaping the people who had controlled her. She had eventually been helped by an organization that worked with trafficking survivors. Later, she had cooperated in federal cases under protected conditions. Publicly returning as Madison Walker, she wrote, could expose people who had protected her and could endanger ongoing cases tied to the network that had taken her. Most painfully, the letter said she wanted her family to know she had survived, but she could not yet promise a reunion. Grace took the letter to Noah first, as she had done with the hospital lead. The family had learned caution through decades of false hope. The letter had to be verified. The paper, postmark, language, and private details were examined. Experts could not prove with absolute certainty that the writer was Madison, because there was no adult handwriting sample for comparison. But no one could explain how a stranger would know so much without access to memories that had never been public. When Thomas and Rebecca finally read the letter, the case changed again. For 30 years, they had searched for a missing child. Now, for the first time, they had reason to believe Madison was not only a victim from the past, but a living woman somewhere in California, carrying their family inside her while still separated by fear, legal risk, and the long shadow of the people who had taken her. The letter did not bring Madison home, but it broke the silence that had lasted since 1993. By 2025, the Walker family had spent more than 30 years learning the difference between hope and certainty. Hope had kept Madison's name alive when the case went cold. Hope had carried Thomas through years of unanswered calls. Hope had helped Rebecca sit with other mothers without becoming empty herself. Hope had shaped Noah into an attorney and Grace into a journalist. But hope had also hurt them. It had arrived many times disguised as a lead, a sighting, a voice on the phone, a girl who looked almost right, a story that almost fit. The family no longer trusted hope simply because it appeared. The letters from California changed that, but not all at once. After the first letter in 2023, and after later contact through protected channels, the Walker family entered a careful process guided by attorneys, federal investigators, and organizations that worked with survivors of trafficking. Madison was no longer only a missing child in an old photograph. She was a living adult whose safety, identity, and past cooperation in federal cases had to be protected. The people helping her did not treat the reunion like a television ending. They treated it like something fragile, complicated, and potentially dangerous if handled carelessly. The investigation into the old trafficking network had continued. Several people connected to the network had been arrested or charged in related cases. Others were dead or no longer capable of influencing witnesses as they once had. Federal authorities could not promise that every risk was gone, but they could offer enough protection for Madison to consider returning to Columbus for a controlled, private reunion. For Thomas and Rebecca, the word returning carried a weight that no one outside the family could fully understand. For decades, returning had been the dream. Now it was also a test of whether they could accept the person Madison had become. Madison agreed to come back under strict conditions. There would be no public announcement before her arrival. No cameras. No press event. No crowd of supporters waiting outside. Grace, despite being a journalist, understood immediately. Madison's life had already been taken from her once by people who treated children as objects to be moved and hidden. Her return could not become another event controlled by other people's hunger for a story. Noah handled the legal coordination with the seriousness of someone who knew that one mistake could turn a miracle into another wound. Rebecca prepared herself in the only way she knew how, by reminding herself that the woman coming home was not the 8-year-old girl preserved in Madison's old room. Thomas struggled most with that truth. In his heart, Madison had remained small for 32 years. Every flyer, every age-progressed image, every anniversary had tried to move her forward in time. But the father inside him had never fully left the night of the fair. When Madison finally returned to Columbus, the reunion did not resemble the simple ending the family had once imagined. There was no sudden repair of all that had been broken. There was no instant restoration of the family that had existed before the fair. The person who came back carried the same name, the same early memories, and enough private details to erase the last doubts. But she also carried a life the Walkers had not lived with her. Madison was 40 years old. She had survived under different names. She had learned to distrust safety before learning to rebuild it. She had been helped by strangers when her own family could not reach her. She had become part of the work of rescuing and supporting other survivors, not because her pain had disappeared, but because she had refused to let it remain only pain. Thomas and Rebecca faced a truth both beautiful and devastating. Their daughter was alive, but she had not been waiting untouched by time. She had grown without them. She had suffered without them. She had made choices without them. She had built a purpose without them. The reunion gave them back Madison, but not the lost years. Nothing could return the birthdays, the graduations, the ordinary school mornings, the arguments, the family dinners, the small unrecorded moments that make a life together. Noah met his sister as both family and advocate. He understood more than anyone how many systems had failed her, and yet he also saw how easily love could become another pressure if the family demanded too much too quickly. He had spent years fighting for victims' rights, but Madison taught him something no case file could fully explain. Survival did not owe anyone a shape that made others comfortable. Grace faced her own complicated reckoning. Her work had helped keep Madison's name alive. Her reporting had helped uncover the hospital lead and connect the case to broader failures. But Madison was not simply the subject of Grace's life's work. She was her sister. The child Grace barely remembered had returned as a woman whose courage could not be reduced to an article, a book, or a headline. Grace understood then that telling the truth also meant knowing when not to take more from someone who had already lost enough. Madison did not move permanently back into the Walker home. She did not pretend the past could be undone by proximity. She kept her work with survivor organizations and continued living with protections that allowed her to remain safe. But she returned to Columbus often enough for the family to begin forming new memories. Careful ones, adult ones, memories not built on replacing the past but on honoring the fact that they still had time. For Thomas and Rebecca, peace did not arrive all at once. It came in small recognitions. Madison knew the old nickname Thomas had given her. She remembered Rebecca's favorite breakfast song. She remembered Noah's stuffed bear from the fair and Grace's childhood game. Those memories proved that the first 8 years of Madison's life had not been erased. Whatever had been taken from her afterward, the love she received before the abduction had remained somewhere inside her, strong enough to survive years of fear, false names, and forced silence. The Walker family eventually allowed the public to know that Madison had been found alive. The announcement was careful, respectful, and limited. It did not reveal details that could endanger her. It did not turn her into a spectacle. It said only what mattered most. Madison Walker had survived, had reunited with her family, and wanted her story to help strengthen protections for missing children and trafficking survivors. After that, the family's advocacy changed again. Thomas and Rebecca no longer stood before other families only as parents still searching. They stood as parents who had found an answer, but not a perfect ending. Noah expanded his legal work into cases involving long-term trafficking survivors and institutional accountability. Grace wrote about the difference between rescue and healing, between finding someone and understanding what survival had cost them. Madison, in her own way and on her own terms, continued helping people who had once believed no one was looking for them. The old question that had ruled the Walker family for more than 30 years had finally changed. It was no longer only, "Where is Madison?" It became, "How do we love her now? How do we make room for who she became? How do we honor the child who was taken without trapping the woman who survived inside that child's shadow?" The answer was not simple, and perhaps that was why it was real. Madison's return did not erase the fair, the lost years, the hospital failure, the false leads, the empty holidays, or the grief that shaped an entire family. But it proved that a life can be more than the worst thing done to it. Proved that love can travel through silence when there is no road back. It proved that a family can be broken by cruelty and still choose to become useful to others instead of being consumed by bitterness. In the end, the Walker family did not receive the perfect happy ending they had dreamed of in the first desperate days after Madison vanished. They received something harder, deeper, and more human. They received the chance to love the truth instead of the fantasy. They received the chance to welcome home not the child frozen in an old photograph, but the survivor who had carried that child through every year of darkness. And that became the message Madison's story left behind. Hope is not the belief that life will return exactly as it was. Hope is the courage to keep loving, keep searching, and keep building meaning, even when what comes back is changed forever. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence means more than words can fully express, because every story shared here is not only meant to be heard, but also felt, remembered, and carried quietly into our own lives. From Madison Walker's journey, we are reminded that hope is not always loud or easy. Sometimes hope is found in a family that refuses to forget, in a mother who keeps loving through guilt, in a father who keeps searching through silence, and in a survivor who chooses to turn pain into purpose. This story teaches us that the people we lose, the wounds we carry, and the years we cannot take back can still become a reason to protect others, to speak up, and to believe that even broken lives can find meaning again. Life does not always return what was taken in the way we dream of, but love, patience, courage, and faith can help us face the truth with a kinder heart. May this story remind each of us to value our families, protect the vulnerable, and never look away from someone who needs help. To support our channel, you only need to give this video a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe so you can continue joining us for more meaningful stories. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for being part of this journey with us.